Our next speaker is the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller. He is a true Renaissance man. He has served multiple administrations. He served as the Deputy Comptroller, where he spoke at this conference. He served as the Comptroller, where he spoke at this conference. He has returned yet once again as the Comptroller again. Please welcome Undersecretary Mike McCord.
Good to go? Yes, sir. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I certainly appreciate this invitation to join with other leaders and partners across this room in national security. I'm sorry, for Jim here that it once again did not work out quite right versus budget release, which is Monday. But I know, Jim, you always put on such a great conference, rain or shine, as it were, that, I'm sure you're having a great session today and will continue to do so. It does leave me a little short of material, however. So let me just say that when we roll out the budget on Monday, you should find more continuity than surprises in terms of priority, in terms of strategy, direction, top line, and programs. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions. Okay, let me just add a few more points. The budget that we're going to send you on Monday, we're going to send everybody on Monday, of course, assume that Congress would act on our 24 budget that we sent a mere 51 weeks ago. It's essential that we get some decisions on that. It really is, because everything we put into the 25 budget assumed builds on 24. I am pretty sure that I'm as tired of talking about CRs as people are tired of hearing me, but let me just take this back to what we're all about here in this room, right? National security is serious business, life or death business, and we need to act as if the collective, we in this town, treat that with the seriousness it deserves. And to me, tolerating 4 months, 5 months, 6 months of CRs year after year after year doesn't meet that standard of seriousness. The overall federal budget process is just not working the way it needs to. If we get our funding bill on March 22nd or by March 22nd in 2 weeks, we will have been in CRs just under 5 years out of the last 15 cumulatively. So that's 1/3 of the time that we have been sitting in the waiting room instead of moving forward. That is not a problem, as you know, that our adversaries have, but it is a problem that we have in duty. It's a problem you have in the industrial base. And it is certainly not a strategy to compete and win with. As we all know, delayed funding means delayed contracting, it means delays in training, means delays in delivery of new capability. And these delays have real-world consequences, most visibly for our partners in Ukraine, who are in a war today, running low on ammunition today. But we have interests no less important, no less serious or sensitive to timely action around the globe. And so these kind of delays that we have sadly become a bit used to inject uncertainty and are detrimental both to our friends and allies around the globe, but also to our industrial base. You may recall that last year, the first thing I talked about last year was the timing worked a little better. The budget had just been released, I think, in our 24 budget was about the multi-years that we had planned to bring to the munitions and missiles space of the industrial base for the first time. Between that initiative and the replenishment funding going to backfill our support to Ukraine in that same area, we really had a path to strengthen that portion of our industrial base. But a year later, here we are in a CR still. We don't have a decision on those multi-years, and it's been 15 months now since Congress gave us any funding to restock our supplies for our inventory for the support we've given to Ukraine. So we are now out of funding, as you know, to support Ukraine, out of funding to restock our inventories until Congress acts. So let me just leave it at there. I don't want to think you all to think that all I do is complain. It's my favorite thing to do is complain, of course, but it's not all that I do. And in fact, it is not all bad news, right? First of all, I would say as an economist, if by degree, if not by profession, really, I appreciate that the work that the Fed, the administration, and others have done to bring us over the last 3 years through COVID without, while avoiding a truly serious economic meltdown, getting inflation coming back down to manageable levels. At the same time, we've had, as you probably know, the lowest 2 years of unemployment, the lowest unemployment rates in over 50 years, not once, but twice in a row, 2022, 2023, and counting. And so for all that to happen at the same time has been very good for us. Yes, interest rates are up, but didn't really expect them myself to stay at zero forever. So all in all, pleased that the economy is stayed on course in a way that helps support what we need to do. And we sort of tacked our way through the squall a little bit, not me personally, but those who really are the decision makers on the larger economic front. So we have that going for us. We have a good strategy going for us. And that strategy has had broad support ever since it was unveiled in 2022. The biggest emphasis I think you'll see in this budget, there's complete continuity on the strategy, but just a little more emphasis probably will be on the innovation space, in line with the direction we've already been taking. So we're talking here about the Office of Strategic Capital, which we're very hopeful we'll get funding for in the next 2 weeks. We're talking about the Raider initiative of the Deputy Secretaries. We're talking about the Replicator initiative. We're talking about the emphasis on JADC2, working with our partners as we do in AUKUS. Like any of our other part of our strategy, or any strategy for that matter, it only works if you fund it. Our strategy is not self-executing without funding, but we have some strong initiatives on the innovation front to complement what we've already been doing. I will say that today, the CR, which I just mentioned, and Ukraine are probably the two uppermost things on my mind. But I want to be clear, the budget, that whether we're talking about the 24 budget, the 25 budget, or 26 or 27, China remains our #1 challenge, our #1 priority in building our program. The Russian invasion of Ukraine did not change that. It did not invalidate that strategy, our strategy. We're going to continue to support Ukraine. We're going to do it through supplementals. It's clearly in our national interest to do so. I've been pleased to see the broad consensus in this town, in Congress, that the U.S. needs to focus on China. That's probably been one of the, again, along with the kind of smooth handling of the economy, that's been one of our biggest tailwinds, has been that consensus around the central part of what we're trying to do. So we've seen this consensus that we need to have a strategy for China, that China's a top priority. We need to stand up to China, and we welcome that alignment. What I have to say I don't get is that there seem to be those who think that standing up to Russian aggression or standing with our allies and partners in Europe is somehow optional or even a harmful distraction from that effort. And I think those folks have a very different understanding of how the world works than I do, I will say. Our strategy has and will retain the challenge posed by China as our top priority, but that does not mean that we can ignore everything else. The Secretary likes to say, and said again this week to us, that he expects us to walk and chew gum at the same time, and that's what the Defense Department has always needed to do and will be doing. On Ukraine, I'm happy to also report that there is a solution available, right? The President requested a comprehensive national security supplemental. It dealt with Asia Pacific, it dealt with the Middle East, it dealt with Ukraine. The Senate passed a very strong version of that supplemental on a bipartisan basis, and we have every reason to believe that a bipartisan majority in the House supports that too, and that supplemental should get a House vote. I don't know if there's anyone else here. There's probably a few who are old, like me, old enough to remember Fram oil filter commercials, right? You can pay me now or you can pay me later was the point of those commercials. So I don't think the right question is, can we afford to support Ukraine if people think this is about affordability? I think really the right question is, can we afford not to? If anyone thinks that we can save money here by looking the other way and cutting off our support to Ukraine and just sort of moving on, I'm as sure as I can be that you're wrong about that. Let me just give a little perspective on that from my own sort of chronology, if you will. When I was born, some time ago, we were spending in the U.S. 9% of our GDP on defense. This was not during a war. This was pre-Vietnam, draft military at that time, focused only on the USSR, 9% of GDP. When I really started my career during the pretty much near the right at the peak, or right after the peak of the Reagan buildup, we were also not in a shooting war. This was post-Vietnam. We now had moved to an all-volunteer force, and we were spending 6% of GDP on defense. Still focused only on Russia, not really focused on China. Now today, we're spending 3% of GDP on defense, still with the all-volunteer force. Now we're looking at China and the PRC, and still this funding is not distorted by any kind of shooting war that we're involved in. All of these three have one other thing in common. They were all in a cycle while we were somewhere in a heavy part of modernizing the nuclear triad, which is something that occurs on a generational cycle, which kind of tracks, not precisely, but pretty much with what I'm saying here. In particular, the bomber leg and submarine leg have been modernized in all three of the windows that I'm talking about. So, in these prior windows, we were spending about as much as we do now as a federal government. Revenues were a little higher. So the fiscal situation, which needs to be taken into account, is not exactly the same as it was. But I say that to make this following point. So we've gone from 9% to 6% to 3%. Does anyone have a good idea how much we've spent on helping Ukraine the last 2 years? The answer is about 0.2% of our GDP over that 2-year period. And I'm not talking about DOD, I'm talking about DOD, AID, state, every part of the U.S. government combined, 0.2%. So it seems to me a little bit of a bargain comparing back to 6 or 9% to spend 0.2%. Someone else is doing the fighting, but our interests are still at stake. So I think if you think about where we might be if Russian aggression is unchecked, it's not going to be a place that we're going to be happy to be. So those are just a couple of the points I want to make without being able to talk about the budget really, about what's going on in the base budget on the CR problems, and also with respect to Ukraine, which is, I think, a huge national security issue for this country. With that, let me wrap up a little early and allow more time for questions, if that's okay, Jim. Yes, sir. All right.
Oh, my God. Well, so much for my canned questions, sir. Yes, Mr. Maynard.
Thank you so much, Secretary McCord. Great presentation. As part of your ROI calculation on Ukraine, could you maybe also comment on the degree to which we've attrited the Russian forces?
Yeah, that's certainly a salient point. We have, as I say, we don't have the same interests Ukraine has at stake, but I think even if you could convince yourself that their interests are not important to us, it's still in our interest. And one of those aspects is, as you say, the Russian military has suffered serious damage, not to all legs, not to their triad, of course, not to their bombers, but their ground forces have lost hundreds of thousands of people. Their equipment has been shown to be inferior to ours, which is, I think, a good message around the world for us as well. And we are the ones, not the ones, doing the fighting and dying to achieve that result. And yet, again, it matters to us what happens here. So I think that this is something, and I don't say this in a callous way, but right, the Russian military, the degradation of the Russian military, given that we don't have our own lives at stake here in doing the fighting, has been a national security bargain in that sense for us. And it is puzzling to me that that there seems to have been this abrupt change. The first year after the invasion, we just because of part of the different cycles Congress was in, we had 4 different supplementals to support Ukraine. 2 were attached to a year-end omnibus funding bill 2 years ago. The last one was attached to the omnibus funding bill 1 year ago. So 2 years ago and 1 year ago were the third one was attached to a CR, happened to be in the fall, and the fourth one was purely for Ukraine. So only one supplemental has ever been just for Ukraine. But we got, within the space of 12 months, the 12 months right after the invasion in February 2022, support 4 times, all of which were rapid and complete support for what we asked for. And it's just been kind of startling to see the pivot since then. Now 15 months since we've been able to get a vote, been able to get a support. We asked in the summer for something on the CR, couldn't get that. We asked multiple times starting in October, and it's been now 5-6 months that we've been asking for a vote on the supplemental that the Senate finally cleared. I'm sure you've seen that there were arguments one day that it wasn't good enough because it didn't have the border in it. Then there were arguments another day it wasn't good enough because it did have the border stuff in it, but it wasn't the version everybody liked. And it's been pretty frustrating for us to see, something that we have, I think, a pretty clear national security interest in, not be able to get across the line, not be able to get a vote in the House. And so that's, I think that would be the solution to the problem, is let it get a vote and let's see what happens. I could still hear
Hello.
you. Yeah,
Sorry. Tony Bertuca, Inside Defense. We know that your FY25 top line is smaller than what was projected. And you said a moment ago that one of the areas there will be a little bit more emphasis in FY25 is going to be the RDT&E side, the innovation side. But we are hearing from Mr. LaPlante, he wants the emphasis to be on production. That sounds like there's an imbalance between procurement and RDT&E. Can you talk about the challenge you had in FY25 trying to balance those out? Because it seems like the fear is that there will be many science fair projects and not enough production lines running with things on them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. My point about emphasis was not necessarily that it was a giant amount of money going to some of these things like Raider and Replicator. By the standard of a F-35, for example, they're a good bit smaller. So I'm a little bit talking about mental emphasis and incremental emphasis over where we were before, trying to get after the agility question as best we can in a world where we don't actually get our funding for 5 or 6 months late. So that's a problem in and of itself. Writ large, we're talking about a pretty minor reduction in our top line, all things considered, under the Fiscal Responsibility Act. I'm sure all of you are probably familiar with it. It was as negotiated over the 2 years, no cut to our top line in 24 and about a 1% cut in 25. So not something that we are going to spend our time crying about that we didn't get everything we wanted. We're still going to be able to have a strong budget and a strong support of our strategy, but there were areas where we have to take a little more risk given that we have this top line cut. I think it's sort of just one more. The delays to me are a bigger problem than the 1%, right? Timely funding is one thing, predictable funding is important, and I do remember saying, I don't remember if I said it in public. If I did, I could be rebuked, but I'll rebuke myself anyway. I did remember saying to people at the time, we struggled over the last couple of years with having even a basic framework of defense spending versus non-defense spending, taking until December, a couple of years in a row, to get agreed to, and then the appropriation process could unfold, and it takes till March. So in 2023, you had the then Speaker McCarthy and the President. Congress passed the FRA. It's like June 1st or June 2nd. 6 months earlier, I thought, well, clearly we can have a better process, a smoother process, and our top line wasn't even changed to get 24 appropriation bills done. Well, clearly I was about as wrong as you can be. We saw absolutely zero improvement in speed from having that predictability of a framework set up in the beginning. And I guess all of us might have our opinions on how it was that we took, I think it was about 7 months sort of a trip through the woods before the next speaker re-agreed to the framework that the previous speaker agreed to. And then it seems like that time didn't seem to benefit us at all. That time spent kind of just renegotiating back to where we started from. So stability and predictability are important to us. We do have some initiatives. I think that when you see on the budget on Monday, the change in the mix won't be maybe startling to you of what we did, of how we took the 1% cut, but the delays that I probably harped on that long enough, right, are just, I think, a lot bigger problem than slight perturbations in the top line for us at this point.
Mike Stone from Reuters. Thanks for coming.
Just in case.
We've got a $4 billion worth of presidential drawdown authority left over for Ukraine now. There have been a couple stories saying that a planning organization like the Pentagon has been looking at doing reprogramming, particularly from Army and other places. Can I ask you, as the king of reprogramming, you're the one that have to do it, what's the size of the reprogramming excursion, the theoretical that you've gone to? Have you gone up to that $4 billion to reprogram to fill all that PDA, or is it onesie twosies?
Okay, that's a great question. First point I want to make is that there is a pretty bright line in federal law and funding process between funds that are available to support the U.S. military that are provided to do, and funds that we can do to train and equip any other military, whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan years ago or Ukraine today. I cannot reprogram money from anything else into support for Ukraine. So Ukraine funding sits, that we've gotten so far, which we are now out of, sat in supplementals that were completely separate bills legally from the base bills that funded DoD. And the ability to reprogram money doesn't cross from the one bill to the other bill, from the base bill to the supplemental. The drawdown authority, the $4 billion in authority, of course, is not money. It is authority, and authority is essential because we also don't have unlimited authority to give equipment that is for our troops to anybody else. Again, we need a specific authority. Drawdown is that specific authority. But the way that and you can exercise that authority if you want to take, more and more risk, you can do that without paying yourself back. The funding in the supplementals is to pay ourselves back and replenish the inventories. That's the funding we're out of, but there's no way I can reprogram to get more of that. So that's really why we need the supplemental to be acted on, because I don't have a legal path to put more money into the restocking of our inventories.
One of the, it's over here, sir, I'm sorry. I sorry about.
Wow.
I think I'm too close to the. All right, sir, we're in the clear. One of the comments you made last year was important. You had commented that perhaps the 2.5% inflation projection might have been overly optimistic in terms of the department was really at a 5% inflation. Or where are we now in terms of inflation? Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? And are there any specific buckets in terms of healthcare or various buckets come to your mind that perhaps might be higher than the 5% you were experiencing last year of inflation?
Yeah, things are definitely trending in the right direction, and we're seeing some of the other forecasters. We don't get our choice of forecasters, right? The Council of Economic Advisors does economic forecasts that are built into our budget for every executive branch agency. We all use one forecast. But looking at CBO and some of the other, the folks that are in this line of work, we do see them all trending down, that inflation is likely for FY25 for the budget that we're submitting to start with a 2 instead of a 5 or a 6. So that's what I'm referring to when I'm saying things are back under control, not that inflation is 0, and not that necessarily fixes everything that happened in the rearview mirror on the cost structure, just that it is becoming a more manageable problem going forward, and we feel good that all the forecasts seem to be moving in that direction, as does the data. Of course, the data itself has been down to about 3 on a 12-month rolling cycle as that's been moving forward. So we do think it's moving in the right direction. The most volatile thing for us for many years, and probably will remain, is fuel. We're a big consumer of that, but no matter how much we consume, we don't consume enough to have any influence on the price. We're not a market maker. We are a consumer, and we use enough of that, especially with jet aircraft, that we're pretty price sensitive there. Healthcare is another one where we are, we have a niche market of our own healthcare system, but we're also heavily into the private sector, and those prices tend to move in ways that we have to react to. And don't always control. We haven't had terrible surprises on that the last 2 years. Again, there's not wood available for me to knock on right here on this plexiglass, but we do feel like we are getting back into more of a manageable period here than what we've seen the last 2 years and when I was here last time.
Looking around the room. One last question, sir.
All right.
And then actually we might be able to take a 7-minute break. Whoop, I'm sorry. Sir, I was, Secretary, it's come to my attention, sir, that Secretary Dotoro would like to speak.
No.
Excuse me, Mr. Comptroller, I'm just curious if there's any leftover money for the Navy that we could actually round up here in the last few minutes.
Yeah. I'm sorry I didn't understand the question. We, as you know, the first dollar is always for the first dollar is the Navy's number 1 on our list and number 1 in our hearts.
Down to that, sir. I feel there's going to be a
It's the
rebuttal.
other people that have to get the leftovers. Don't tell Frank I said that when he comes by later today.
So Secretary Dotoro did say as he was going back to his seat, how is he going to pay for the Houthi missile attacks for the SM-6s that they're firing off against the UAVs from the Houthis?
Well, when we first submitted a supplemental in only about 2 weeks after the Hamas attack on Israel, we didn't have any data on things like that, so it was not part of our supplemental. The Senate included that. When I say they passed a strong supplemental, it was a strong supplemental. They touched that area. So we would just, the best thing the House could do is to vote on what the Senate passed, which would give us $2.4 billion across the department to deal with the operational costs, largely borne by the Navy, to respond to both on Poseidon, Archer, Prosperity Guard, and both aspects that the Navy's covering down on.
I only ask this because Secretary Dottor is a very large man, and I'm standing right next to him. Is there any other vehicle for his 3.4 billion of the submarine industrial base funding for his AUKUS? Is there any other
Yes,
vehicle other than the
that
supplemental?
also, of course, is in that same supplemental.
Yes, sir.
I remember supporting Secretary Austin. He did a hearing with Secretary Blinken in late October. It was mainly about Israel at the time, but also Ukraine. AUKUS was part of our supplemental. It had been sent to Congress. That was part of what the hearing was about. It was a 3.5-hour hearing, and it was 3 hours and 15 minutes into that hearing before anybody asked about AUKUS. And the reason is because there is such broad support for it. People felt like no questions, they had no issues, they had no concerns, and I believe that it remains that way. People want to support the industrial base. We're going to have programs in the 25 budget. We had them in the 24 budget, but that supplemental piece is a very strong cement sort of between 24 and 25 for those who care about the industrial base, which a lot of folks do. The solution is right there, and again, we believe it is broadly supported in Congress. It needs to get a vote in the House.
In closing, sir, is there anything else? We're almost out of time. I see the red light flashing in the back. Is there anything else? What keeps you up at night other than where's the 2024? Where's the supplemental?
Yeah. I got to say, I guess on a personal note, it is the diminished consensus on foreign policy that I see that underlies the difficulty of getting the supplemental. I don't think we experienced this, when Ronald Reagan was president, when Harry Truman was president. There wasn't a lot of a question about how to deal with the Soviet Union before it was, not called Russia at the time, and why it seems to be so problematic now. I think there's some internal divisions at home and just some lack of clarity that concerns me, and then connect that with the inability to get things done at the speed we need to. Not trying to be a hater. I mean, this Congress has not gotten a lot done, right? We have passed CRs. We have shown that we can do that. We have avoided default, but we're looking for proactive things as well as avoiding completely falling off the cliff. And coming together and getting things done has proven problematic. And we all understand, right? There's a 2-vote, 3-vote margin. It's hard to get things done. There's a 1-vote margin in the Senate and not much more in the House. Divided government is often challenging, but the world keeps moving faster, and this town is not. And so there was recently just yesterday, in fact, a PPP commission talked about how we could be more agile in the budgeting process, but the agility issues are not limited to the budgeting process here. We are part of it, to be sure, but the environment that we swim in here is not running as smoothly as it should, and I think that again, there's just sort of a lack of cohesion and pulling together that is probably what keeps me up at night about the country writ large, including my job.
I think you speak for everybody here. Please thank Undersecretary McCord.